The advertisement had been direct: widower with land claim seeks sturdy wife who can ride. No poets or faint hearts. Finian Black had paid the territorial newspaper 50 cents for those 12 words. He had imagined a woman with broad shoulders and hands used to work, someone who could help him wrestle his stubborn patch of Nevada dirt into a life. But the woman who stepped down from the freight wagon in the blistering August sun was not sturdy. She was slight, barely a woman at all, and the light blue of her prairie dress seemed too delicate to survive an hour in the dust. Her name, the freighter grunted before driving off, was Lynn. Finian stood on the porch of his clapboard house, a structure that looked as temporary as a sigh. He was a man built of long lines and quiet angles, his face weathered by more than just the sun. He had bought this land under the Homestead Act, hoping the silence and the hard labor would scour away the man he used to be. The name on the deed was his, but the name whispered in saloons from Cheyenne to Sacramento was not. That man, a man who had lived by the speed of his hands, was supposed to be dead. "You're Finian Black." Her voice was clear, without the tremor he expected. She held a small, cloth-wrapped bundle and stood her ground, her gaze direct. He just nodded, his throat suddenly tight with dust and disappointment. This was a mistake. A terrible mistake. He had sent for a partner, not a ward. She looked no older than 18. The ad said sturdy, he finally managed, the word sounding harsher than he intended. "I am sturdy enough," she said, her chin lifting a fraction. "And I can ride." He looked past her at the endless expanse of sagebrush and heat shimmer. His 2 horses, a temperamental gelding named Ghost and a steady mare, stood flicking flies in the corral. He had a dozen head of cattle that were more bone than beef, a well that threatened to run dry every summer, and a neighbor, a rancher named Barrows, who wanted this particular patch of land for its access to the creek. Barrows had made it clear he considered Finian a temporary problem. A woman like this wouldn't last a month. She would wither in the sun or be scared off by the profound loneliness of the place. Therefore, he decided the only decent thing to do was send her back on the next wagon east. "There's been an error," he said, stepping down from the porch. "This is no place for you. I'll pay your passage back to Carson City." Lynn did not move. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, scanned the hard-packed yard, the lean-to barn, the distant mountains shimmering purple through the heat. She seemed to be measuring the place, not with fear, but with a strange, quiet appraisal. "You paid my passage here. I have no people in Carson City." The arrangement was made. The arrangement. It had sounded so simple on paper. A proxy marriage, a signature on a document, a life sent west in a crate of hope. But the reality of her, standing there so small and so determined, was anything but simple. To send her back was to send her to nothing. He knew what happened to lone women in places like Carson City. However, to keep her was to invite a different kind of disaster. Barrows would see her as another vulnerability, another soft spot to press until Finian broke. "It's not safe here," he said, trying again. "Nowhere is safe," she replied, and the simple finality of it silenced him. She was right. Safety was an illusion you bought with money or power, and they had neither. He let out a long breath, the air burning his lungs. The sun beat down, and the silence of the valley pressed in. He looked at her face, really looked at it, and saw not fragility, but a stillness that was its own kind of strength. It was the stillness of a person who had seen worse than this and had survived. "The house has 2 rooms, he said, turning back toward the porch. "You can take the one in the back. The well is low. We haul water from the creek for the stock." He did not offer to take her bundle. He did not welcome her. He simply stated the facts of their shared hardship. She followed him inside. The main room was sparse, a table, 2 chairs, a cold stove, and a cot in the corner which served as his bed. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old coffee. She walked past him into the small back room. It was little more than a closet with a window, containing a narrow bed frame with a thin mattress. He heard her set her bundle down. When she came back out, she had untied the bonnet that protected her face from the sun. Her black hair was pulled back tightly, emphasizing the determined set of her jaw. "Where is the creek?" she asked. He was taken aback. "A mile east." "It's a hard walk in this heat." "You said we haul water," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I will help." He almost told her no. He almost told her to rest, to acclimate, to understand the crushing reality of the work before her. But something in her expression stopped him. It was a look of profound competence, a quiet refusal to be treated as an ornament. He had asked for a woman who could work, and she was offering to do just that. "The buckets are by the door," he said, his voice flat. "The mare is gentle. The gelding bites." He watched from the porch as she walked to the corral. She moved with an economy of motion he had only ever seen in seasoned ranch hands. She didn't approach the mare head-on, but from the side, speaking in a low, soft tone he couldn't quite make out. The horse, usually skittish with strangers, lowered its head and allowed her to slip the bridle on. Lynn didn't use the mounting block. She swung herself up onto the mare's bare back with a fluid grace that made his breath catch. She rode out of the yard without a backward glance, two empty buckets clanking softly, a small figure in a pale blue dress against a vast, indifferent landscape. Finian Black stood there for a long time, the 50 cents he'd spent on the advertisement feeling less like a waste and more like a wager whose stakes he did not yet understand. He did not yet know that the woman riding away from him was carrying a secret that had pushed her 1,000 miles from home. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm of shared silence and relentless work. Lynn rose before the sun, her movements quiet and purposeful. She mended his worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She learned the quirks of the old stove, coaxing bread from it that was better than any he'd ever eaten. She never complained about the heat, the dust, or the meager rations. They spoke very little, their conversations limited to the necessities of running the homestead. The fences down in the south pasture were low on flour barrows as men rode the property line again this morning. Finian found himself watching her. He watched her hands, surprisingly strong as she cultivated a small garden beside the house, coaxing stubborn green shoots from the baked earth. He watched the way she moved around the horses, with a calm authority that the animals seemed to understand and respect. Ghost, the gelding who had tried to take a piece out of Finian's arm more than once, would nuzzle her shoulder and stand perfectly still while she cleaned his hooves. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was watchful. He was a man accustomed to measuring people by what they didn't say, and Lynn was a master of unspoken things. He knew she was waiting for him to trust her, and he knew he was waiting for her to break. The breaking point came not from her, but from the sky. One afternoon, the brassy dome of summer turned a bruised purple. The air grew heavy and still. Finian had seen skies like this before. "Flash flood," he said, standing on the porch and looking toward the narrow canyon that fed their creek. "Get to the barn. Bring the mare." He ran for the corral to get Ghost, his mind racing. The dozen head of cattle, their most valuable asset, were grazing in the low pasture directly in the path of any floodwaters. Losing them would mean ruin. By the time he had the gelding saddled, Lynn was already there, the mare ready. "I'll help you with the cattle," she said, her voice steady despite the rising wind that whipped her blue dress around her legs. "No," he said, his tone sharp. "It's too dangerous. You'll be swept away. Stay in the barn." "They are your livelihood," she stated, ignoring his command. "They are our livelihood." She swung herself onto the mare's back, her face set. There was no time to argue. A low roar was already echoing from the canyon. He spurred Ghost toward the pasture, expecting her to follow at a safe distance. But she didn't follow. She galloped past him, her slight form bent low over the mare's neck. She rode not like a homesteader, but like a rider born in the saddle, her movements one with the horse. The cattle were panicked, milling in confusion as the sound of the approaching water grew louder. Finian tried to turn them, yelling and waving his hat, but they were too spooked to move. He was one man, and the herd was scattering. Then he saw Lynn. She wasn't trying to force the cattle. She rode to the far side of the herd and began to move them with a series of precise, daring maneuvers, cutting off their escape routes and using the mare's body to guide the lead steer. It was a kind of horsemanship he had never seen before, a partnership between rider and horse that was like a dance. She didn't shout. She seemed to anticipate the herd's every move, turning their panic into a focused stampede in the right direction, up toward the high ground. The first wave of muddy water, thick with debris, surged into the pasture just as the last of the cattle scrambled to safety. Finian sat on his horse, soaked by the spray, and watched her. She sat atop the mare on the ridge, her dress plastered to her frame, her hair coming loose from its pins, and she looked not like a fragile girl, but like a force of nature in her own right. That evening, the storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and smelling of wet sage. The air in the small house was cool for the first time in months. Finian lit the lantern, its yellow light pushing back the shadows. Lynn was sitting at the table, cleaning mud from a bridle with a damp cloth. "I've never seen anyone ride like that," he said, his voice rough. It was the first time he had spoken to her about anything other than work. She didn't look up from her task. "My father taught me." "Who was he?" She paused, her hand stilling. "He broke horses for the railroad. The wild ones no one else would touch." She finally looked at him, her eyes holding a deep sadness. "He was good. Too good. They worked him until he was broken, then they cheated him of his pay." The story hung in the air between them, a truth more real than any of their polite silences. He understood now. Her competence wasn't just a skill, it was a legacy. It was all she had left of her father. "What happened to him?" Finian asked softly. "He went to confront the foreman. He never came back." She looked down at her hands. "I took the money he had hidden and bought a ticket as far west as I could get. I saw your advertisement in a paper in Sacramento." So she was not just a mail-order bride. She was a fugitive from a world that had consumed her father. She had not chosen this life out of desire, but out of a desperate need for refuge. He had seen her as a burden, but the truth was, she was a survivor. Something inside his chest, a place that had been hard and knotted for years, began to loosen. "You saved the herd today," he said. "You saved this place." "We saved it," she corrected him quietly. Before he could respond, a heavy knock rattled the door. Finian's hand instinctively went to his side, where a pistol no longer hung. He opened the door to find two men on the porch. One was Barrows, a large man with a florid face and eyes as small and hard as pebbles. The other was the territorial marshal, a man whose authority was absolute in this part of the country. "Black," Barrows said, his voice thick with false politeness. "Sorry to call so late. The marshal and I were just discussing a matter of some importance. A matter of a fraudulent land claim." Barrows held up a deed, the paper looking crisp and official in the lantern light. "This document shows my family was granted this parcel, including the creek access, back in '68. Which means your homestead filing is void. You're a squatter, Black." Finian looked from the deed to the marshal's impassive face. He knew his own deed was legal, filed properly with the land office. But Barrows was a powerful man, and Finian was a nobody with a past he couldn't afford to have examined. A legal fight would be costly and slow, and the marshal's presence meant Barrows was confident. This was not a negotiation, it was an eviction. "My claim is legal," Finian said, his voice dangerously low. "The court will decide that," the marshal said, his gaze flicking past Finian to Lynn, who now stood in the doorway behind him. "In the meantime, Barrows has filed an injunction. You're to vacate the property by the end of the week." The words hit the room like a physical blow. A week. Everything they had worked for, the cattle she had saved, the garden she had nurtured, all of it would be gone. He could fight it, but it would mean going to town, hiring a lawyer he couldn't afford, and drawing attention. Attention was the one thing he could not risk. The man he used to be had left bodies in his wake, and while the law had never caught up to him, memories and grudges had a longer reach. Barrows smiled, a slow, predatory expression. "Don't worry, Black. I'm a reasonable man. I'll give you $200 for your cattle and your trouble." More than fair for a squatter. He looked at Lynn again, his eyes lingering in a way that made Finian's blood run cold. Perhaps the girl can be part of the arrangement. Before Finian could move, Lynn stepped forward. "This land is ours," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that startled all three men. "We will not be leaving." Barrows laughed. "You have no say in this, girl." "I am his wife," she said, looking not at Barrows but directly at the marshal. "Under the Homestead Act, a wife has a claim equal to her husband's. You cannot evict one without evicting the other. My name is on the filing." Finian stared at her. It wasn't true. He had filed the claim alone, long before he had even written the advertisement. He had never added her name. But the marshal didn't know that. Barrows didn't know that. It was a bluff, but it was delivered with such conviction that for a moment, even Finian believed it. The marshal's expression flickered with uncertainty. He was a man who operated by the book, and this introduced a complication he hadn't expected. "I'll have to check the records at the land office," he said, frowning at Barrows. "This changes the nature of the injunction." Barrows's face darkened with fury. "She's lying. There's no record of a wife." "Then the records will prove it," the marshal said, clearly annoyed at having his time wasted. "Until then, this is a civil dispute. Settle it yourselves." He tipped his hat curtly and walked back to his horse, leaving Barrows sputtering on the porch. Barrows pointed a thick finger at Finian. "This isn't over, Black. You and your little China doll. You'll regret this." He stormed off into the night. Finian closed the door and leaned against it, his heart pounding. He turned to face Lynn in the quiet of the small room. The lantern light cast long shadows on the walls. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "He was going to take our home," she said simply. "You looked like you were going to let him." She was right. He had been ready to run again, to sacrifice this life to protect the secrets of his last one. He had been so focused on the ghost behind him that he had failed to see the woman standing right in front of him. She had risked everything, telling a lie that could get her in serious trouble with the law, all to protect a home she'd only known for a few weeks and a man who had treated her with little more than detached courtesy. "They'll find out you're not on the deed," he said. "The marshal will be back." "Then we have until he returns to make Barrows go away," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. He looked at her, truly seeing the steel beneath the delicate exterior. He had sent for a sturdy wife, and the universe, in its infinite and cruel wisdom, had sent him something far better. It had sent him a fighter. That night, for the first time, he offered her the chair by the fire. He took the other one, and they sat in a silence that was no longer watchful, but companionable. He found himself telling her about the land, about the way the light changed in the mornings, about the hawk that nested in the tall pines on the ridge. He didn't talk about his past, but he talked about his future, a future he had almost given up on an hour earlier. And she listened. The next day, Finian rode into town. Lynn's bluff had bought them time, but he knew it was only a matter of days before the marshal checked the records in Carson City and returned. He needed a plan, and his old instincts were screaming at him. The easiest way to deal with a man like Barrows was with a gun. It would be quick, final, and it would undo all the work he had done to become Finian Black, homesteader. It would mean running again, and this time, he would be running from a murder charge. But as he rode, he thought of Lynn. He thought of her quiet courage, her unwavering belief that this place was theirs. To resort to violence would be to betray her faith. It would prove that he was still the man he was trying to bury. There had to be another way. He spent the day asking quiet questions in the saloon, listening to the gossip of freighters and merchants. Barrows was a big man in the territory, but he was overextended. He had bought up too much land on credit, betting on the railroad building a spur line through the valley. Finian learned that Barrows's original deed, the one the marshal had seen, was held by a bank in Reno as collateral on a massive loan. If that loan went into default, the deed would belong to the bank, not to Barrows. A plan began to form, a dangerous one that relied on speed and the telegraph, the fastest thing in the West. He sent 2 messages. The first was to a man in Reno, a man he had known in his former life, an acquaintance who owed him a significant favor and happened to work as a clerk in that very bank. The message was cryptic, a string of words that would mean nothing to the telegraph operator but everything to the recipient. The second message was to the land office in Carson City, a simple inquiry about the filing status of Barrows's claim, signed with a name that wasn't his. He rode home under the stars, feeling the old tension in his shoulders, the familiar hum of a high-stakes gamble. When he returned, he found Lynn waiting on the porch, a lantern at her feet. She had saved him a plate of food. She didn't ask where he'd been or what he'd done. She simply said, "The cattle are restless tonight." They stood together, looking out at the dark pasture. "It's because Barrows's men are out there," he said. "They're trying to spook them. Drive them off." "They will not succeed," she said with that unshakable calm of hers. "No," he agreed, looking at her instead of the darkness. "They won't." 3 days later, Barrows returned. He didn't bring the marshal this time. He brought 4 hired men, all of them carrying rifles. They rode into the yard and dismounted, spreading out to form a menacing line. "Time's up, Black," Barrows snarled. "The marshal's on his way back from Carson City. He knows the girl lied. This time, he won't be so polite. I'm giving you one last chance to take my offer and walk away." Finian stepped onto the porch. He was unarmed. Lynn stood in the doorway behind him, just as she had before. "Your offer is withdrawn, Barrows," Finian said, his voice carrying in the still morning air. Barrows laughed. "Is that so? And who's going to make me?" "The Bank of Nevada," Finian said. "I got a telegraph this morning. Seems you missed a payment on your loan. A big one. The bank has foreclosed. As of yesterday, that deed you're so proud of belongs to them. And they have no interest in this little piece of dirt. They have, however, filed a formal complaint against you for attempting to seize assets under false pretenses." The color drained from Barrows's face. "You're lying." "Am I?" Finian held up a piece of paper. It was just a receipt from the general store, but in the bright sun, it looked official enough. "The telegraph came through an hour ago. The new circuit judge is very interested in cases of land fraud. Especially when it involves a man who's already bankrupt." Barrows stared at him, his mind clearly racing, trying to find the flaw in the logic. His hired men looked at each other, their confidence wavering. They were hired for muscle, not to get involved in a legal battle with a bank and a federal judge. "The marshal knows," Finian pressed, pushing his advantage. "He got a wire, too. He's not coming here to evict me. He's coming here to arrest you." That was the final blow. Barrows looked from Finian's calm face to his uncertain men and back again. The fight went out of him, replaced by a desperate, panicked fear. He scrambled onto his horse. "This isn't finished," he yelled, but the threat was hollow. He and his men rode out of the yard, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled slowly in their wake. Finian stood on the porch, the flimsy receipt still in his hand, his whole body trembling with the aftermath of the bluff. He had gambled everything on a few well-placed words, fighting with his wits instead of a gun. Lynn came and stood beside him. She gently took the paper from his hand and folded it. "You did not run," she said softly. "No," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't." He looked at her intelligent eyes and the quiet strength in her face. "I have a home to protect." 3 months later, the first snows of winter dusted the high peaks. The valley had settled into a peaceful quiet. Barrows was gone, his empire of debt having crumbled just as Finian had predicted. The land was theirs, undisputed. The cattle were fat and healthy, and the small house felt less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. One afternoon, Finian was repairing a fence in the south pasture. He looked up to see Lynn riding the mare across the golden fields, her hair flying free behind her. The light blue dress had been patched and faded by the sun, but on her, it looked like a banner of victory. She rode with the same effortless grace that had stunned him on her first day, a part of the land itself. She reined in the mare beside him. "The well is holding steady," she said, her cheeks flushed from the cold air. He nodded, leaning against the fence post. "You were right," he said. "About what?" "That we would save this place." He looked at their small house, a curl of smoke rising from the chimney. He had sent for a wife who could ride, a practical solution to a practical problem. He had received so much more. He had found a partner, a woman whose courage had forced him to find his own. Her presence had not been an addition to his life, it had been a transformation. The quiet gunslinger was gone, replaced by a man who knew the value of a home. Lynn smiled, a small, rare expression that lit up her whole face. "It is a good home." Finian reached out and gently took the mare's rein, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. It was the first time he had touched her. A current passed between them, warmer than the winter sun. The silence that fell was not of hardship or uncertainty, but of a deep and settled peace. He had spent years running from his past, but in the quiet company of this unexpected woman, he had finally found a place to stand his ground. If you enjoyed the story of Finian and Lynn, you might like the tale of a lone school teacher who finds herself in charge of a dusty Texas town after the sheriff mysteriously disappears. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next story from the heart of the American West.